From the founding of the NFL in 1920 until 1993, when the Players Association first won real free agency and an equal role with the commissioner in deciding on issues affecting players, NFL players had almost no bargaining power with the owners except for brief periods when a rival league was bidding for them. Competition from the All-America Football Conference in the 1940s, from the American Football League in the early 60s, from the World Football League for 2 years in the mid-70s, and from the United States Football League for 3 years in the mid-80s, each time forced NFL owners to increase their players' salaries or risk losing them to the rival league. But as soon as the other league collapsed or was merged with the NFL, salaries flattened out again, and NFL players had to take whatever the owners were willing to offer. This situation did not change until 1993, but it took almost 40 years of bitter labor conflict to get there. NFL players first organized in the late 1950s over some basic demands that seem ridiculously meager today. A minimum salary of $5,000, per diem in training camp for the first time, some minimal protection in case of injuries. As basic as these demands seem, the owners refused to recognize the union until the courts forced them to. The fundamental issue for the owners then, like now, was control. They were the owners, and they fought against any attempt to make them share control with mere players. And Congress had to help them with an antitrust exemption for the mergers that eliminated competition for players. The players nearly called a strike during training camp in 1970 over the owners' failure to meet their financial obligations. That one was avoided, but not in 1974, which saw the first of 3 major strikes or lockouts, all of which the players lost, but which eventually led to free agency and the other benefits that the players finally won in 1993. In 1974, there was a 44-day strike during training camp. The players asked for increases in benefits and the minimum salary, a whopping $12,000 for rookies and $13,000 for veterans. But the major conflict was over what were called freedom issues, some basic employment rights, such as mutually binding contracts, and a challenge to the absolute power of a commissioner paid by the owners in ruling on player grievances and compensation for clubs if a player tried to change teams. These rights are so basic and so taken for granted today that it's hard to believe that players haven't always had them. In 1982, a 57-day lockout by the owners was the first during the regular season, and it canceled 8 games. The chief issue this time was the union's demand for a percentage of league revenues that, in addition to raising salaries, would have made the Players Association a partner with the NFL in running league business. The owners, of course, would not even consider that. In 1987, players struck for 24 days, affecting 3 regular season games. This time, the owners didn't cancel the games but put together teams of so-called replacement players, a nicer term than scabs, along with the NFL players who crossed the picket lines. The primary issue for the players this time was free agency, while the owners actually demanded a reduction in the current levels of compensation that had risen due to competition from the USFL. In all 3 of these major conflicts, there were hardliners and moderates among the owners. But the NFL always stacked its bargaining team with hardliners, and during the strikes, all owners are ultimately owners. In 1974, for instance, the hardest of the hardliners included the Giants' Wellington Mara and the Bears' George Halas. Mara later became regarded as one of the grand old men of the NFL, a father figure to Giants players. But in the 60s and 70s, he was fiercely anti-union, and the Giants were notorious for cutting their player reps, even when there wasn't a strike. Halas was even less subtle about his anti-union sentiments. After he cut the team's player rep and most vocal strikers at the end of the 1974 strike, Halas boasted to reporters, "It's the greatest bleeping thing that's happened to the Bears in 5 years. We got rid of some of these malcontents. Great day." Altogether, in 1974, 7 player reps and all 4 union officers were cut, traded, or placed on injured reserve against their will during or after the strike. And the owner's basic attitude hadn't changed by 1987. Tex Schramm, the general manager of the Dallas Cowboys, who led the NFL's bargaining team in '87, made a statement to Gene Upshaw that summarized the owner's attitude toward players over this entire period. "We're the ranchers," Schramm told Upshaw. "You're the cattle." All 3 of the strikes or lockout were costly to both owners and players, but also to the popularity of the NFL, alienating fans who mostly blamed the players for being greedy. The owners won each time for 4 main reasons: their enormously greater financial resources, their control of the media, their ability to stay on message while players told reporters whatever was bothering them, and the players' lack of solidarity, in stark contrast to the Major League Baseball Players Union. In 1974, between a quarter and a third of the players crossed the picket lines over the 44 days of the strike. In 1982, no players crossed because the owners locked them out, but there were bitter divisions within the union that undermined the players' position. And in 1987, 261 out of 1,600 players crossed the picket lines, including some of the league's biggest stars. The players have had many strong leaders going back to the 1960s. Guys like Bernie Parrish and John Gordy in the 60s, John Mackey and Ed Garvey in the 70s, Marvin Powell and Gene Upshaw in the 80s and 90s. Mackey, Powell, Kermit Alexander, Freeman McNeil, and Reggie White put their names on the lawsuits that eventually won free agency and a fair share of league revenues for all players. But the strikes and lockout, particularly the strikes of 74 and 87, tested every player in the NFL. With labor peace since 1987, it's hard to imagine how ugly the strikes of 1974 and 1987 were. Players who crossed the picket lines were not just saving their own paychecks, but stealing from their striking teammates, and the guys who stayed out despised the ones that went in. The strike simply tore teams apart. Guys who crossed the picket line used lots of different reasons to justify their actions. The Baltimore Colts middle linebacker Mike Curtis has the unfortunate distinction of being the first scab in NFL history. Curtis told reporters that he was already being paid more than he was worth, and he accused the union of greed. Some players said that they were grateful for whatever the owners gave them. Some couldn't imagine what they would do if they didn't play football. Several players in 1974 defended their right as American citizens to make a personal decision, as if it had no impact on their teammates or the rest of the players who remained on strike. The Cowboys' John Nyland told reporters that he prayed over his decision to cross the picket lines, and he quoted scriptures from Ephesians, Colossians, and Timothy, commanding slaves to be obedient to their masters. There are lots of ugly incidents during the 1974 strike. Eagles quarterback Roman Gabriel flipping off his teammates who screamed at him as he drove past their picket line. Striking Green Bay players arrested at the request of Packer management for picketing an exhibition game at Lambeau after the players had tried to work with the coaches to prevent splitting the team. Fights breaking out between strikers and strikebreakers in training camps in Houston and New York after the strike collapsed. Imagine the locker rooms everywhere after the striking players came back to join the teammates who had betrayed them. Most of the top quarterbacks honored the strike in 1974. Guys like Joe Namath, Len Dawson, Fran Tarkenton, Billy Kilmer, Archie Manning. But some didn't. A turning point in the strike came when Roger Staubach decided to give it up. 2 days later, 3 more starting quarterbacks, Bob Greasy, John Hadle, and Terry Bradshaw, followed him. After that, it was just a matter of time before the whole thing collapsed. Heroes of the 1974 strike included strong player reps like Ken Bowman in Green Bay, Ed Flanagan in Detroit, Tom Mack in Los Angeles, Del Williams in New Orleans, and Alan Page in Minnesota, whose leadership was the major factor in keeping his Viking teammates out of camp. Among the other heroes, some were stars, some were not even starters. One of the few Miami Dolphins to hang tough until the very end was All-Pro guard Larry Little, who told reporters that he would have stayed out indefinitely, even if it came down to just me and Doug Swift, the Dolphins player rep. I wasn't going to let Swift take it by himself, he said. The Eagles' Kevin Riley, an ordinary player rather than an All-Pro, put it this way: the thing is, you can only play football so long. You have to be a man the rest of your life. In 1987, there were hero scabs and ugly incidents again, this time with more public attention because the strike disrupted the regular season, not just training camp. In Dallas, All-Pro defensive tackle Randy White drove his truck through the picket line as his teammates screamed scab at him. Cincinnati and Miami had been among the worst teams in supporting the strike in 74. This time, Boomer Esiason and Dan Marino kept their teammates together. Most of the top stars stayed out in 87. Besides Esiason and Marino, guys like Jim Kelly, Warren Moon, John Elway, Walter Payton, Marcus Allen. As always, some didn't, including Lawrence Taylor, Tony Dorsett, Danny White, Mark Gastineau, Mike Webster, Howie Long, Steve Largent, and Ozzie Newsome. Some familiar names here. The strike collapsed after the most famous player in the league, Joe Montana, crossed the picket lines in San Francisco, along with 10 teammates, including Dwight Clark, Roger Craig, and Russ Francis, while guys like Ronnie Lott, Randy Cross, and player rep Keith Fonor stayed out. When the 49ers played at Atlanta a few days later, a local sports columnist named Dave Kindred just ripped into Montana. "I don't like the strike," he wrote, but I like the idea of hanging tough as a unit 1,500 strong. I like the dignity it takes to stay on the picket line even as you work within the union to make sense of the situation. Montana's a jerk in love with his checkbook. I'd rather dig ditches than look in the mirror and see Joe Montana. As in 1974, lack of solidarity tore several teams apart. It also damaged the reputations of some Hall of Fame players. And again, imagine the locker rooms all around the league after the strike collapsed. The players ultimately won their war with the owners, but not on the picket lines, but in court, because they had antitrust law on their side and could not lose there. But it took nearly 6 more years after the 1987 strike collapsed. The rights that the players won in the 1993 collective bargaining agreement, the owners had been arguing since 1974 would ruin the NFL. Instead, they laid a foundation on which everyone was soon rich beyond anything they had imagined. Free agency raised players' average salary from $490,000 in 1992 to $663,000 in '93. Since '93, it has risen to $1.9 million. Player benefits have likewise risen, including a 40% increase in pensions and significant additions to disability benefits that the NFL had previously rejected. But the players' new wealth was not at the expense of the owners. Since 1993, total league revenues have increased over 500%, from $1.4 to nearly $8 billion. The average value of an NFL franchise has increased from $129 million to slightly more than $1 billion. With labor peace and the Players Association now operating as a true partner in running the business of professional football, the NFL became the most spectacular success in professional sports. Since 1993, television rights have soared from $900 million a year to $3.7 billion, and this past season saw the highest TV ratings in years. 30 of 32 clubs have built new stadiums or renovated old ones, creating a major new source of revenues from luxury suites, premium seating, naming rights, and local advertising and sponsorships. Ironically, all of the new revenue from stadiums is the source of the current problem. The 1993 CBA was extended with little difficulty in 1996, 98, 2000, and 2002. But in March 2006, the union demanded a share for the players from all of this new revenue generated by stadiums. The owners dragged out negotiations until they had to rush into an agreement by the deadline. Now they've opted out because they claim that many franchises are losing money. But they refuse to open their books to show the evidence, and the financial data that is available just doesn't back up their claims. According to Forbes magazine, from 2006 to 2009, total league revenue increased from $6.2 to $7.6 billion, while profits increased from $985 million to more than $1 billion, an average of $33 million per club. No one knows how much the owners actually make after all their tax write-offs because the owners won't open their books. The problem is that revenues have not increased evenly among the franchises, and the owners who make more money simply don't want to share it with the ones that make less. The owner's problem, in other words, is with each other, not with the players or the union, but they want the players to pay for it. Some of the owners also seem to want to return to the good old days when the owners owned and the players had to accept whatever they were given, when the owners were the ranchers and the players were the cattle. But it won't happen, because the current labor conflict is different from the ones in 1974, 1982, and 1987 in some fundamental ways. The players, for a change, will enjoy overwhelming public support. For the first time, it's the owners who are demanding a greater share of the profits, who seem greedy and unwilling to share. The players aren't asking for anything except to continue an arrangement that works well for everyone, including the NFL's millions of fans. The owners, as always, are far richer than the players, but because of the prosperity of the NFL since 1993, the players have greater financial resources than ever before, and several owners have large debts on new stadiums or franchise fees that won't allow them to simply wait out the players indefinitely. Most important, the players are more unified today than ever before. NFL players have learned the importance of presenting the owners with a solid front, of staying on message, of sticking together. Here's the bottom line today. It's the owners, not the players, who are threatening to jeopardize an arrangement that has benefited everyone and to alienate the fans to whom the whole system depends. For the first time, everyone recognizes that. The players' position has never been stronger. NFL football players today are not overpaid but have fewer rights and benefits than players in the other major sports, including just 5 years of health care after retirement, despite playing in the most dangerous of all the sports. NFL players have less for just one reason. their lack of solidarity when they were tested in the past, and their willingness to cross picket lines and work for the NFL against their teammates on their own clubs and around the league. The players will win this time by sticking together.